The experts included 5 PhD biologists, 4 PhD biochemists, 3 PhD chemists, 1 PhD geneticist, 1 PhD quantum physicist, 2 PhD philosophers of science, 1 PhD professor of education, 3 biology teachers, a Muslim journalist, and an attorney. Dr. Bill Harris has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Hanover College in Hanover, Indiana, and a PhD in nutritional biochemistry from the University of Minnesota. He was the developer of the Omega-3 Index, a new blood test to assess cardiovascular risk, for which he has gained international standing.
We have an obligation, we think, to teach origin science in the most neutral way possible, without religious bias, without naturalistic or philosophical bias. And that way we do the best science and we end up neutral with respect to the Constitution. In order to accomplish that, we require that all the data that's relevant, the scientific data that's relevant to the issues of chemical evolution and macroevolution, be put on the table. That the presentation of one side of that controversy, data supporting one side of that controversy, without the presentation of data that's contradictory to that hypothesis, is not scientifically acceptable and also biases the discussion. So in a word, our hope is that at the end of these hearings, we will be allowed to teach the controversy that does exist over origins. The strategy of our opponents has been to mischaracterize our position and actually to malign some of us who are presenting that position. They have consistently and remarkably, in my mind, refused to engage in a discussion of the scientific substance of the issue. Our opposition has chosen to fight this battle with name-calling. This is a posting on the Kansas Citizens for Science website, dated February 10th, 2005. It was written by Liz Craig, who is a member of that organization and involved with some of the public relations. My strategy at this point is the same as it was in 1999. Notify national and local media about what's going on and portray them in the harshest light possible as political opportunists, evangelical activists, ignoramuses, breakers of rules, unprincipled bullies, etc. There may be no way to head off another science standards debacle, but we can sure make them look like asses as they do what they do. Our target is the moderates who are not that well educated about the issues, not that well educated. We're talking about education here. Most of whom probably are theistic evolutionists. There's no way to convert the creationists. The methods of natural investigation, they don't invoke spiritual forces to account for what they observe in the world. They look for natural causes. And I think that's fine to look for natural causes. But when you don't find any natural causes, it's time to fess up and say we don't know. Instead of saying, well, there was a natural cause, we don't know what it was, but we have faith that that's what happened. So methodological naturalism really puts blinders, I think, on the search for truth, particularly in the area of origin science.
Why in the area of origin science?
Because that's a historical science. It doesn't get much more historical than billions of years ago. Nobody was there to know what happened. Nobody watched it. We cannot say with any surety how anything came to be. Every experiment, particularly in the origin of life field, where they've attempted to use, quote, natural environments to produce even some of the simplest chemicals of life, have consistently failed. Since 1950s, they have failed and failed and failed and failed, and yet they are still in the textbooks presented as the plausible explanation for how life arose. But those experiments have failed. It's dishonest, in my view, to portray failures in the laboratory as successes in a textbook. The tremendous amount of data in scientific literature, particularly in biochemistry, but also in cosmology and many other places, that points, that has identified, I think, certainly since 1953, when DNA was, the code was cracked by Watson and Crick. What Watson and Crick discovered was a code. They discovered a code. Every other code in the world that we know of came from a mind. To conclude that DNA at some level somewhere originally came from a mind is not an irresponsible deduction from the data. When we look at some of the biochemical machines that are in cells, and some of our witnesses will attest to this, and maybe even show some pictures. And now that we understand how some of these fantastically complex machines that work inside the simplest cells, we can see them now. We understand them now. The advance in modern molecular biology has shown us a world that can only be explained, in my view, by positing some kind of a plan in a direction. I don't know who did it. I don't know how it was done. I don't know why it was done. I don't have to know any of that stuff to detect design. If I walked into my garage today and I found a 6-foot bacterial flagellum laying there and spinning at 100,000 RPM, I would have no idea what it was, besides maybe my weed whacker gone nuts. But I would have no question in my mind that it was a designed object. I would just not know what it was. But you can infer design just by examining something without knowing anything about where it came from.
Why do many mainstream scientists, evolutionists, if you will, refuse to accept the idea that DNA is a code?
Oh, no, I don't think anybody refuses. I just don't think they think about it very deeply.
Okay.
I mean, everybody knows it's a code. I just, in my opinion, they haven't sat down and taken a deep breath and said, where did that come from? And really think about the fact that the bonds along the backbone of the nucleic acid are sugar phosphate bonds. Every bond is identical. There's nothing chemically that's different between the bond between an adenine and a glycine, or a guanine nucleotide containing a nucleoside. So the fact that they form this chain is kind of like letters on a page. The letters don't have to be in that sequence. When they are in that sequence, they communicate information, but they don't have to be that way. In the same way in DNA, the letters don't have to be in the sequence they are by any chemical reason, any law, any natural cause that we know of. Therefore, just like text in a book, the code in DNA has the fingerprints of intelligence. But the nature of that intelligence, the purpose of that, how it happened, I don't know. But I can come to a conclusion of, at least a tentative conclusion of design, without knowing anything about where it came from. If a Coke bottle fell out of the sky into an African desert, and I was a native, you know the movie I'm talking about, Gods Must Be Crazy. Those people knew that Coke bottle was designed, but they had no idea what it was.
Dr. Bruce Samat earned his Ph.D. in 1983 from the Department of Physiology at the University of Minnesota. For the past 11 years, he has taught courses at Northwestern College on biochemistry, human physiology, developmental biology, immunology, genetics, cell biology, and animal biology.
The students provoked me to know everything about evolution because they came up with so many questions. The textbooks were very dogmatic in their approach to evolution, especially macroevolution and origins. No one had any trouble in my class talking about microevolution and diversity. No questions come from that. Everyone's just amazed how well that works together. But everyone has questions about how macroevolution can work. I found 11 years ago that I couldn't answer that. Now, 11 years later, I still can't answer that. And I read everything. Some of the provocation coming from the students came from the wording within the textbooks. In the chapters, for instance, in genetics, when I teach that course, the wording, the verbs, if you will, used in describing mutations is very precise and very accurate and very declarative. They, with data, are able to declare that the mutations are deleterious, that there are insertions, deletions, etc., and that they cause problems with the function of that gene. And then when we get to the chapter on macroevolution, the question is asked, and this is pages later, chapters later, the question is asked, can macroevolution lead to new forms of life? And the answer in one word was certainly. And then all of a sudden, the verbs changed to what I call soft verbs. No longer is it we know, we have tested, data shows. It is now should have, could have, must have been. And my students picked up on that and wondered why all of a sudden there aren't declarative verbs here and everything is very soft in its wording. That was provoking me. I had to find out why. So I've been reading extensively, and the textbooks are written accurately. It is a lot of soft verbs. There has to be, because there's a lot of stories of how it possibly could have happened. But there is no data to back that up such that we can say we have tested or we have produced such a phenomenon.
We should be able to challenge that.
Yeah, and all things should be available for challenging. That has been part of my anger with science, is that nothing is sacred is the norm for all other disciplines except evolution. Then all of a sudden it becomes the sacred cow. I have had an occasional outburst in class by me when I'm lecturing, when I have to tell students that, by golly, when I did my master's research, thesis research, and when I did my postdoctoral research, and when I did 15 years in the companies with their research, everything is held up to scrutiny and skeptical analysis. Nothing is left untouched. Nothing is taken for granted. Nothing is taken on faith. Everything must be proven. Nobody else gets away with that. Peer review editors don't let you get away with that. In your conclusions, you say, and I speculate. You don't say, this is the truth because I made this story up. But not in evolution. My students coming out of a Christian college are now armed with all of evolution, exactly what it teaches, and exactly what its downfall is, or its shortcomings. They know what it can show, and they know what it can't show. I would say that they're probably better armed than their counterparts who are going to the University of Minnesota, who are not shown what, in fact, it can show and cannot show. So who has more knowledge and who has more accurate knowledge? Those who know what a theory can do and what it can't, or those who are just told the party line?
So true data, true conclusions. If we want quality education in Kansas, we should also teach evolution and its criticisms. Wouldn't you agree? Is that what you do at your school?
Well, for macroevolution and in origins, if you're going to teach just from the textbook and those tenets of what it should be able to do, then you're not actually teaching the story, the entire story of evolution. You're teaching a segment of it.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Samad, I have been a proponent and stated earlier, and will state again, like your comment on it, of empirical science as defined by observable, measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, the empiricism is the heart of science. And once you start leaving empiricism, it's okay, but you need to say it. And you need to know the difference between what's empirically and supportable and what is, in fact, become more of a story.
Dr. Jonathan Wells is a senior fellow at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He has 2 PhDs, one in molecular and cell biology from the University of California at Berkeley, and one in religious studies from Yale University. Subsequently, he has performed postdoctoral research at UC Berkeley and has authored 2 books concerning evolution.
Specifically, probably most notoriously, in 2000, I published a book, Icons of Evolution, in which I showed that many of the major images used in biology textbooks as evidence for evolution, in fact, do not fit the evidence. The one I first discovered was the picture of embryos, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, because I was studying embryology, and I would compare the pictures with the embryos I was actually looking at and realized that there was a discordance there. And I went on from there to study various other icons and found similar discrepancies between the icon and the evidence. Well, the peppered moth icon which has pictures typically of peppered moths resting on tree trunks where we now know they don't normally rest, is used as evidence for natural selection. Well, I have no quarrel with natural selection, so I'm not saying that the falsity of that icon refutes natural selection. But for each icon that I deal with, what I do say, and I think legitimately, is that if this is thought or presented as some of the best evidence we have for Darwinian evolution, and so much of it is false, where does that leave the theory? Because sooner or later, if a theory is going to be scientific, you have to test it against the evidence. And if piece after piece of that evidence turns out to be exaggerated or distorted or even faked, then I think the theory itself at some point becomes suspect.
Your criticisms in Icons of Evolution tend to weaken evolutionary theory. Would you agree with that?
The evidence is what weakens evolutionary theory. I have no desire to weaken any theory except by comparing it with the evidence. What I don't want to weaken is science. But science thrives on comparing theory with evidence. I'm going to pick 7 phyla, 7 major groups. We're in the chordate group. If we look at the molecules in these organisms and we group them according to the similarity of their molecules, we can rearrange them thus. So the molecules here are most similar. They're more similar to each other than they are to these, for example. These are more similar than they are to those. So we can regroup these according to the similarities in this particular molecule. Now, if we construct a tree, an evolutionary tree following Darwin's pattern, based on this molecule, we get something like this. But be clear that the only data we have are up here. We have the molecules from these organisms, and the rest of this is inferred based on the assumption that they share a common ancestor. What's interesting is when we look at these molecules, various discrepancies immediately appear. For example, the tree I just showed you from 18S RNA doesn't fit the classical tree that had been drawn on the basis of morphology or anatomy. Animals that are close together up here are far apart over here. Not only that, if I pick a different molecule, 28S RNA, I get a different tree again. Okay, here's the 18S tree, here's the 28S tree. Okay, once again, animals that are closely related by one are not closely related by another. Imagine if you found out that your grandfather was not the least bit related to you, but, related to people half a world away. I mean, this is pretty fundamental biology stuff, It matters who you're related to. Even worse, if we take 18S RNA and submit it to 2 different laboratories, as it was done in this case, again, we get 2 different trees. So the molecular evidence is shot through and through with discrepancies. A recent article in Nature shows that this controversy is continuing. These trees here, it shows these 2 trees in Nature. Here, we, the chordates, are most closely related to the arthropods, or the insects. But according to this other molecular study, we're way off here, and the insects are more closely related to roundworms. Now, these are not trivial issues in molecular or evolutionary biology. So the inconsistencies in evolutionary trees based on molecular comparisons have to actually be explained away in the light of evolutionary theory. They actually don't provide evidence for the theory. Now, I'm not saying the theory is proven false, but this certainly doesn't provide evidence for it. Now, in Darwin's theory, this is a very simplified cartoon of it. The phyla that I showed you a few minutes ago are up here. And if we had a good fossil record, which of course we don't, we would expect to find something like this in the past, where these branch off somehow from a common ancestor that might be, for example, some form of worm. Ideally, this is what we would expect. When we go looking at the fossil record, what we find instead is this. Most of the major animal phyla appear abruptly, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian explosion, with no fossil evidence that they actually came from a common ancestor. Theory versus evidence. Now remember, common ancestry might be true at lower levels, but at this level, the level of the animal phyla, the fossil evidence certainly isn't helping us. Darwin himself recognized this. He said this actually presented a valid argument. Suddenly appear in the Cambrian must at present remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against his view of common ancestry. I would argue, as a biologist, that the problem has not been solved in the intervening 150 years, at least not from the fossil evidence. The way Darwinian evolution is often presented as though there's overwhelming evidence for it and no dispute about it. Clearly that's not the case, so I do think students should be exposed at least in outline to these problems. What does it do to Darwin's theory? Well, I think it weakens Darwin's theory. The evidence weakens Darwin's theory. But for science, that's good. If the theory doesn't explain the evidence, then it should be weakened in the eyes of the students. They shouldn't be told something explains evidence that isn't there. They should be aware of the evidence. On the way down here was finally getting a chance to read a book. It came out in 2003. It's called Origination of Organismal Form. Now, these are eminent evolutionary biologists. As far as I know, there is not an ID proponent in there, certainly not a creationist. As far as I know, all of them have a faith that sooner or later completely natural explanations will be found for all these phenomena. But to a person, these writers say quite clearly that there's a problem extrapolating microevolution to macroevolution, a scientific problem. It's just undeniable. It's throughout the scientific literature.
You keep using the term Darwinian evolution. You would agree, would you not, that since Darwin, the science of evolution has advanced greatly?
Well, then I would include in that neo-Darwinian evolution, which is just Darwinism combined with
You keep
genetics.
using Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. Isn't it, in fact, the science of evolution that we should be speaking about and not using terms that are intended to simply draw a reaction? If
No,
we're interested in speaking about science?
I prefer to be precise. The problem is the term evolution, as several speakers before me pointed out, is vague. I mean, it can mean change over time. I've seen it defined in textbooks as a change in gene frequencies. Well, that's not correct. My children have different gene frequencies from mine, and they haven't evolved.
Please answer my question, Dr. Wells.
I'm trying to be precise about the definition of evolution.
It is true, is it not, that since Darwin 150 years ago, the science of evolution has advanced greatly. As an example, Darwin had no knowledge about genetics, did he?
No, he didn't. That's why I said neo-Darwinism is Darwin's theory combined with modern genetics. If someone could show me a mechanism whereby an ape-like creature could turn into something like a human, I would accept it. But I've looked and I haven't found it. Not even remotely close. When Newton proposed his theory of gravitation, it was dismissed as supernaturalism because it was action at a distance. What constitutes supernaturalism in today's science may very well not be supernatural in tomorrow's science. That's why I emphasize the process of testing hypotheses against the evidence.
I understand, sir, but there is a difference between looking at nature and asking questions versus looking at questions and because we cannot find an answer at the moment, assuming that it had to be an intelligent designer.
That's not how intelligent design works. Intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance. What it does is it sets certain criteria by which we normally, in the course of our daily lives, determine whether certain things are designed or not. And then it argues that that can be extended to features of the natural world. Obviously, that's a controversial claim, but I think it's a legitimate one.
With the hypothesis of neo-Darwinian evolution that there is common ancestry, why doesn't the analysis, the evidence that about the 18S RNA tree versus the 28S RNA tree falsify that? Why doesn't that do that?
In my opinion, because neo-Darwinian evolution has left the realm of science. It now functions as an assumption, an underlying given, a dogma. It cannot be falsified. Nothing will falsify it because it's just a given. It does make predictions, I would argue that virtually every prediction it has made above the species level has been falsified in the sense you just described. And yet the theory is still with us. And I would argue that that is evidence for its non-scientific nature.
We have a lot of people addressing us and saying, well, this is not science. And why? And when I say, well, I think it has scientific basis, they still argue that it's not science. Can you address any of that? Why is intelligent design science then?
Well, it's interesting. If you read the evolutionary literature, at least before the last few years when this started brewing more heatedly, Darwinian evolutionists have consistently argued against design. Darwin himself did. Hundreds of pages in The Origin of Species are devoted to arguing against design. The argument was the evidence will show that what looks like it's designed can actually be explained by natural processes. Now, if evidence can show that something is not designed, then in principle, evidence can show something is designed. You can't have it both ways. You can't say suddenly, well, you can't argue for design because all of a sudden that involves something supernatural. Darwin was excluding the supernatural and claiming that the evidence justified it. I would say if you're going to resort to evidence on one side, you can resort to it on the other. And for me, that's all intelligent design does. It says the evidence we see points to design. Where we go beyond that is a theological question. Well, I'm also a theologian, so I love those questions, but that's not science for me.
Dr. Michael Behe received a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored over 40 technical papers, as well as the best-selling book, Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, which argues that living systems at the molecular level are best explained as being the result of deliberate intelligent design. For the past 20 years, Dr. Behe has been professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University.
I'd like to start by saying that it's not just myself, not even just ID people, intelligent design people, but a number of scientists have been skeptical that microevolutionary processes, Darwinian processes, can explain larger patterns in biology and especially in the molecular biology of the cell. For example, Stuart Kauffman, who's a professor at the University of Calgary right now, wrote in a book in 1993 that it is not that Darwin is wrong, but that he got hold of only part of the truth. For Darwin's answer to the sources of the order we see all around us is overwhelmingly an appeal to a singular force, natural selection. It is this single force view which I believe to be inadequate, for it fails to notice, fails to stress, fails to incorporate the possibility that simple and complex systems exhibit order spontaneously. And this was published by Oxford University Press, an academic publishing house. Why are some scientists skeptical that Darwinian processes can account for what they see, especially at the molecular level of life? Because in the past 50 years, science has discovered, much to their surprise, and which was completely unknown in the time of Darwin, that the cell, the basis of life, is composed of machines, literally machines made out of molecules. This illustration up here is a cover from the journal Cell, which was published in 1998, a special review issue on the topic of molecular machines. And inside, on the table of contents, there are listed a number of articles, such as the cell as a collection of protein machines, polymerases and the replosome, machines within machines, mechanical devices of the spliceosome, motors, clocks, springs, and things. And the editor of this special issue was a man named Bruce Alberts, who is the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And in his introduction, he states, "We have always underestimated cells. Undoubtedly, we still do today. But at least we are no longer as naive as we were when I was a graduate student in the 1960s. The chemistry that makes life possible is much more elaborate and sophisticated than anything we students had ever considered. Indeed, the entire cell can be viewed as a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a set of large protein machines." Now, why is this a difficulty for Darwin's theory? He wrote that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, My theory would absolutely break down, adding, but I can find out no such case. Here he was insisting that his was a gradual theory. Natural selection had to improve things slowly, in many steps, over a long period of time. He knew that if things improved too quickly, it would look like something other than random processes were involved. Well, what sort of a system can't be explained or is very difficult to explain by numerous successive slight modifications? One which is irreducibly complex or has the property of irreducible complexity. This is a fancy phrase. It just means that you've got a system with a number of different components that interact with each other to produce a function beyond the system or beyond the components itself. And an example I cited in my book, Darwin's Black Box, on this from our everyday life is a mousetrap. A mousetrap has a number of different components, such as a spring, holding bar, catch, and so on. And it needs all these components to work. If you take away the catch, if you take away the spring, if you take away the holding bar, it's not that it works half as well as it used to, it's broken, it doesn't work at all. Now, things like this are a problem for a gradual theory like Darwin's because the function of an irreducibly complex system only appears essentially when the system is complete. In intermediate stages, there's nothing for natural selection to select. And after it's finished, there's not a whole lot for natural selection to do. So things like this are challenges to Darwin's theory of gradual evolution. So are there any such irreducibly complex systems in the cell? And I argue that there are many of them. Yes, they're all over the place. This is the bacterial flagellum. It is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a number of different components, like a propeller, which actually pushes against the water and pushes the bacterium forward as the rotor spins. There's a hook region, which acts as a universal joint to attach the propeller to the drive shaft. The drive shaft is attached to the rotor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside to the inside of the cell. There's parts that act as a stator to keep it clamped onto the cell membrane, just like an outboard motor has to be clamped onto a boat as the propeller turns. And there are many other components as well.
In the first paper that you did with Dr. Snoke, what was the bottom line conclusion of that? Could you sort of simplify that?
The bottom line was that a process called gene duplication, where a gene coding for a particular protein is duplicated and is free to accumulate mutations, is unlikely to lead to new protein features which require more than a couple amino acid changes to produce them. Once you go beyond just one change to lead to the new feature, and you need 2 or 3 or 4, which is the case if you need to develop a new specific interaction between two proteins, then the expected amount of time that would take in reasonable population times starts to become prohibitive, over 100 million generations and higher.
And how many members of the population in that 100 million generations?
Well, again, it depends on the number of loci, but if you consider about 6, which is roughly the number of amino acids involved in a specific interaction between two proteins, it would take on the order of 10 to the 21st or so, which is would be prohibitive for virtually any organism except a single-celled organism.
10 to the 21st?
Yes. That's a big number.
It is important to keep science and religion separated, correct?
No, no, it's a very complex business. By that example, I was trying to say that what some people think to be religion at the time may turn out to be understandable later on. But if you rule out an explanation which seems to describe the data pretty well because it seems to have unwelcome philosophical or religious overtones, then I think that does science a disservice.
Roger DeHart has taught biology at the high school level for 28 years. Mr. DeHart taught intelligent design for 10 years without receiving any complaints. After a complaint was filed, he was not only forbidden from teaching intelligent design, but was forbidden from teaching any criticisms of Darwinism.
I supplemented the text in 1992 with a portion of Pandas and People. I would then allow students to critically analyze. I would always put this in the third person, saying that this was differing views from other scientists. And then I would allow students to either write a position paper stating 3 best evidences for or against Darwinian evolution, and then those students who would like to have the opportunity to debate the topic in front of the class. It was always done in an even-handed way. There was the same number of students for both sides. They had the same amount of time, and it was a good experience.
How did the students react to it?
Well, overwhelmingly, many students saw that as the favorite part of biology. Much of biology is merely restating of facts, of rote material that's in the textbook. This was an opportunity for students to critically evaluate, and they had a say, actually, in their opinion of what they thought.
And how long did you use that methodology?
I did that for 10 years.
And during that 10-year period of time, what kind of response did you get from parents?
Positive.
Could you amplify a bit on that?
I had positive up until 1997, and I had one complaint. The complaint was not lodged with me or the school district. It went straight to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU then contacted my superintendent. I had to submit a handwritten summary of all that I was to say in the 2-week unit. And then finally I was reassigned to Earth Science. The person who took my job was a former student. He was a PE major. He had 0 years of teaching experience. I left the school district. My love is biology. I've taught that for 28 years. As I said, at that time it was 23 years. That's what I was trained to do.
Were the supplemental materials relevant to a comprehensive understanding of biological evolution?
The supplemental materials that I presented gave a different picture of the interpretation of the evidence than what was in my text.
Was that different interpretation relevant to student understanding of biological evolution?
Certainly, and I think that's what has been testified. Some of those issues, the origin of life, homology and things like that, have been spoken to earlier in this.
And you believe all those are relevant?
Yes, I do.
Can the student really understand biological evolution without having that additional information?
Well, I don't think they can accurately weigh the evidence. I mean, that's not what current science is showing, so they're giving a dated or misrepresentation.
And then you went from there to another school. Tell us about that.
Well, the other school was 40 miles south. That school, I was very upfront. I didn't want to be caught in the same situation again. I went in, had an interview. I was selected for the position. I told them right up front who I was. I told them of my controversy. I told them before I accepted the job that I still wanted permission to give the criticisms of the textbook and allow students an open education. I was notified by phone 3 days before I was to take the position that I had been reassigned again to Earth Science.
And where are you teaching now?
I teach at Oaks Christian High School, which is college preparatory high school just outside of LA in Westlake Village. I teach honors biology and AP biology.
And how do you teach it there?
We teach just the textbook version, and then once again we look at criticisms of the text and where they may have misrepresented the evidence, and then I present the case for intelligent design.
And how do the students? And
They enjoy it. It's always, once again, as I stated before, I think it's one of the best units that we have. And it just gets kids to be able to critically think. And that's what we as teachers want to do.
Do you think a public school system should prohibit teachers like you from teaching criticisms of evolution that would somehow weaken the theory?
Well, supposedly a scientific theory is supposed to withstand criticisms. That's why we have them. They go through, that's why they're repeatable, and that's the nature of science. It's supposed to be self-correcting mechanism because of the challenges that other scientists bring to it. So if it doesn't cut the mustard, it shouldn't be there.
Do you believe that when we don't understand the answer to something, it is appropriate to attach to it a supernatural explanation in science?
No, I do not, but if the evidence leads there, we should go there.
Are you aware of the fact that there is not a single major national or international scientific organization that agrees with you on that?
I realize that if anybody held the views that I did, they would no longer be a member of that group.
Please, no sign, please. Just confine your comments.
And is it your opinion that the reason that happens is because those organizations are biased against views such as yours?
A study put out in 1999 by Ed Larson held that the National Academy of Life Sciences, 95% of them, held a naturalistic view of the Earth.
But isn't the presumption or the hypothesis that is intelligently designed one based on opinion, philosophy, faith, the supernatural?
No, it's not, because I can't find a single piece of evidence where Darwinism would be falsified. I mean, we've seen that in junk DNA. That was supposed to be the thing that pointed right to common ancestry, and now we're finding that there's purpose in it. But yet Darwinism is not falsified.
Can you comment on whether or not it would be of value for students and of value for teachers to have the words, instead of just use the word evolution, at least to try to differentiate between when they're using the word evolution, in what sense they are using it?
Yes. Yes, that needs to be done. That's all I can say. Yes, emphatically.
Ms. DeHart, I thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.
Jill Gonzalez Bravo received her master's in curriculum instruction with an emphasis in science and technology from Wichita State University. She is currently employed in Rose Hill, Kansas as an 8th grade teacher, where she has served on a committee that has developed curriculum maps for science content.
I have been a teacher for the last 10 years, and though encouraged to boycott, I felt that this issue is not about me. It's about the students and their rights. And so that is what I'll be speaking to today.
Give me some examples, and what kind of feedback do you get from them?
Okay, during my 4 years of completing my area of focus in biology at Kansas State, I became very versed in the theory of evolution. I learned that it was an undebatable fact among many of my professors. I also caught on very quickly to the idea that, and this was a perceived idea, but that if anybody that believed differently, they were not considered a true intellectual. I was amazed the day the topics of origins came up within the class. It turned into a heated debate and a heated argument, I should say, with me as the target. This is where the conflict came into play. I have students who at first glance gave the impression that they cared very little about school and science, but somehow this topic was important to them. However, my previous education had taught me that there was no controversy. There was no data that supported evolution. It's not factual. I had never read anything to the contrary, so I had no idea how to lead or even whether I could allow the discussion to continue. I just wasn't sure. I was left with two questions to reflect on. First one, this is the teacher in me. Why does this topic evoke strong opposition from the majority of my students? And then why was I apprehensive about providing my students with the academic freedom to investigate and question what they perceive to be controversial? I felt as a professional that it was my duty to try to understand what about this topic of evolution these students oppose so strongly. Let's say that a student does not bring up the controversy surrounding the peppered moths in England, and therefore I don't, because as a science teacher, I have been encouraged not to do anything to weaken or diminish evolution by the National Science Teachers Association. What do you suppose the child will think when he later finds out this discrepancy surrounding this evidence? To me, it would do more harm to teaching of evolution as a unifying theory of science than to the teaching of science. The student will begin to question why they were lied to about this issue, or at least they will perceive deception. Whether it's there or not, that is their perception. And they'll wonder what else is untrue. There may be scientists that could explain this away, but as an educator, how are we to deal with these controversies being brought up in our classrooms? We rely on scientists to provide us with unbiased content for our classrooms. That's why we rely on our textbooks. This is our source of information and knowledge that we give to our students. I take issue with invalidating anyone's thoughts because they may be derived from a worldview counter to mine. This concerns me, and that is why, with much contemplation, I chose to speak today. This has not been exactly a career move to speak of, when so many have chosen to boycott. But I am here not to advance my own agenda, but to promote greater academic freedom for our children.
What is so significantly absent from the majority case is the data. Where is the data to support the claim of evidence so overwhelming that there can be no dissent? So the case for the majority simply is completely and totally empty. There is no evidence, there is no data, only oratory. Look in your dictionary for the definition of the word boycott. Boycott is a mechanism designed to coerce silence. It's a mechanism to intimidate. And so what is happening here is that you're seeing those in positions of authority seeking to discourage and intimidate scientists from stepping forward and stating what is in their minds, what is in their heart. It is ugly. It is really ugly. This is what the strategy is. Quote, the strategy at this point is the same as it was in 1999. Notify the national and local media about what's going on, all of you in the audience, and portray them in the harshest light possible. Dr. Harris is the most humble guy I think I've ever known, and his brilliance is just mind-numbing. The guy is an internationally recognized scientist. He is doing work that could affect the lives of everybody in the entire world in a very positive way. And he is being derided as an ignoramus, as an unprincipled bully, as a breaker of rules. There may be no way to head off another science standards debacle, but we can sure make them look like asses as they do what they do. This is not by ID scientists. This is a compilation of about 17 articles of molecular biologists and biochemists. And at the beginning of the book, they raised 26 issues that evolution cannot explain. They're not being able to explain with natural selection. And they start off. The very first question is, why did metazoan body plans arise in a burst? How did we get all of these body plans very suddenly? And what is the policy of the National Science Teachers Association? Do not adopt any policies that will suggest to students that life arises suddenly rather than gradually. You see, we can't show them any evidence that violates Darwin's prediction that diversity arises in a purely gradual way. What the problem is the fossil record is really inconsistent with that prediction. I have Greg Lassie. I have Ed Sisson. And these guys are being painted as ignoramuses, as unprincipled bullies. Anybody who criticizes evolution. Jill Gonzalez Bravo was in fear, was literally in fear to come and testify here. That is a situation that our society should not tolerate. So thank you for this opportunity to speak and to give my closing argument.
Members of the Kansas State Board of Education Subcommittee on State Science Standards are Ms. Connie Morris, Ms. Kathy Martin, and Dr. Steve Abrams, Chairman.
Mr. Irgonagaray put up a PowerPoint that said that scientists will not participate because it gives the veneer of respectability. This would seem to indicate that science is more about obtaining respectability and not about seeking the truth. Obviously, if all the science was on the side of the evolutionists, they would come and embarrass the scientists that made presentations last week and those of us on the board by completely destroying the scientific evidence presented last week. Alan Leshner was quoted as saying, "Scientists love to fight, they love to argue in public, and they love to refute each other's point of view." If you look around the room, there's a lot of people here, a lot of cameras here. This seems like a pretty public place, a good place to have a debate about the evidences in science, particularly when that's what we're looking for. But indeed, no, such is not the case. What does happen instead is boycott.
As a teacher for over 31 years in Kansas public schools, I did applaud and cheer for the outstanding young science teacher from Rose Hill as she presented her experience in college classes and her classroom, and the educator from Ohio who's been a leader in helping his state to address this issue. The board has been accused of being closed-minded, and these hearings as being rigged. I guess we'll leave it up to the public, who might be the jury in this matter, to answer some of the questions that I would have liked to ask the council based on what we've heard these 4 days. Which side of the issue is being closed-minded?